So thank you very much, Joe Haldane, and my esteemed colleague, Professor Paul Spicer, is also here from Hokkaido University, and he is someone who tempts me not to stay fit by inviting me to go for drinks quite often. Skiing is something that I do to keep myself sane. So, as just introduced, I am Jeff Gaiman from Hokkaido University, and today my topic is going to be the meaning and message of Indigenous and Fourth media with a focus on media created by the Ainu. And I have to provide a caveat right away that I am neither a specialist in media or in media consumption. And so I have immediately made the mistake of referring to fourth cinema, which refers to movies which have been created by Indigenous peoples as fourth media. So my title is incorrect from the very start. So one day I opened my email to find a request from Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, who were working on a protest, an article on a protest action by Ainu fisherman Hatakeyama Satoshi, who is someone who I have worked very closely with for about the past decade. Hatakeyama-san is someone who intentionally fished without a permit so that he could garner the public attention that would accrue to him from getting arrested and the ensuing court case. So in its message on the to go back, this is very important for the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, the IPRI, because one of their missions is to broadcast criminalization of Indigenous peoples and their actions. And so this was what motivated me to take the angle which I'm taking in this presentation, which is the soul-wrenching incidences of criminalization of Indigenous peoples and their actions, which are something that I feel that Indigenous peoples want us to know. So in their message regarding the conferral of the Right Livelihood Award to the co-founder of the IPRI, Joan Carling, in 2024 of this year, the Right Livelihood Committee had this to say about the current situation of Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Indigenous peoples are frontline defenders of biodiversity, cultural heritage, and sustainable development. In the Philippines, as in many parts of the world, Indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable because their lands hold vast reserves of valuable resources like minerals and forests. These territories have long been targeted by corporations seeking to exploit them for profit. The stakes are high. 75% of key mining areas in the Philippines overlap with Indigenous territories, which contain some of the world's richest gold reserves. Despite these resources, Indigenous communities remain some of the poorest in the nation, and they face constant threats of violence, displacement, and criminalization for defending their lands. The Philippine government, under successive administrations, has frequently labeled entire Indigenous communities as insurgents or terrorists to justify extrajudicial killings and forced displacement, cementing their systemic marginalization. So while the situation of Indigenous or ethnic minority peoples in the world is not as dire as that portrayed here, this is not something atypical, as my newsfeed reminds me daily. And this resource exploitation and systematic marginalization is something which is held in common with the Ainu people of Hokkaido, with whom I work. So I think that it's very important as a prerequisite to achieving social justice that we are thinking about these kinds of issues. And I believe that they relate to media production and media consumption. So one purpose in my presentation today is to think about media from that angle. And I'll be going through some, I'll be using the example of Indigenous cinema. So the situation is not one without hope. Indigenous peoples throughout the globe have themselves responded to their challenging circumstances and sought to improve their situation proactively through legal recourse, direct action, and activism, including through the media and arts. In so doing, they have banded together in solidarity with one another and with lawyers, journalists, lobbyists, and researchers like myself. In broadcasting their situations, their conditions are a reality that Indigenous peoples want to be known. So it is from that standpoint today that I will be introducing some examples from Indigenous media. And of course, not all Indigenous or Ainu people share these views or are equally vocal as the examples that I will be introducing, but nonetheless, I think it's an important story. So to go back to Joe Haldane's introduction, how is it that someone who was originally an education major, I once used to teach English to kindergarten children, ended up being someone who is so urgently espousing the message of Indigenous peoples? Well, that's what happens when life proceeds. So currently, I am the head of a citizens society for examination of Ainu policy. I'm the member of the board of directors of an Ainu NPO, a member of a supporting civil society organization for the Raporo Ainu Nation, who are involved in a lawsuit against the Japanese state and the Hokkaido government in order to obtain communal fishing, harvesting rights. And I'm a member of a faculty lobby group. And in such capacities, in the past year or so, I have been to Tokyo to lobby members of the Diet, and I've also testified to the United Nations. However, as I just said, I'm not a specialist on media or media consumption. My desire is simply to point out the positionality which Indigenous peoples are wishing for us to take. And some questions raised might be, how can we support the movement of Indigenous peoples through support of Indigenous peoples' media? Or are there do's and don'ts which should be considered in consumption of Indigenous creative media? So one of the most important distinctions I wish to posit in my presentation is that between other representation and self-representation. And I think probably all of you will be familiar with the one-sided depictions of Indigenous and ethnic minority peoples, or the appropriation of their languages, cultures, and symbols in the media. For example, the trope of cowboys and Indians, or cultural appropriation, for example, in professional sports like the Washington Redskins, or in consumer products, for example, Geronimo cigarettes, in which Indigenous perspectives tend to be absent, or seriously marginalized or maligned, and Indigenous peoples are depicted by non-Indigenous actors, and the locus of control is with non-Indigenous peoples. So on the other hand, Indigenous directors and producers and ordinary Indigenous citizens have taken advantage of recent leaps in technology and the impetus of other minority groups and individuals to boldly produce their own media, which features Indigenous actors and subjects in which the Indigenous perspective is central, and the locus of control of the editing and production is within Indigenous hands. So for example, the director and the producers of the movie Atanarjuat, the Fast Runner, are themselves Inuit. And Alanis Obumsawin, a director, risked personal harm and the desertion of one of her cameramen when filming the Oka resistance movement in Toronto to produce the film Kanesitake, 270 Years of Resistance. So one very important question that I would like to pursue is, where do the Ainu people fit on this spectrum between these two poles? However, there's one more very important perspective that I would like to touch upon, which is that of Indigenous futurities or Indigenous futurisms, which, as this slide indicates, carry very serious political implications. So what I mean by Indigenous futurities or Indigenous futurisms, I think all of you are probably thinking about the futures of your communities or the futures of your countries. But when we talk about Indigenous peoples, they tend to be something which is relegated to the past, as if they didn't have a future as a community or a group or a nation. Some key features of Indigenous futurities are conceptions of time, being liberated from the shackles of confinement to the imagined pasts of quote-unquote imperialist imaginations, openness to radically alternative conceptions of temporality, for example, thinking about time as something which occurs in cycles rather than linear progression, collective imaginations of alternative Indigenous futures in which there are relations between humans and other denizens of this world. So, how about the positioning of Ainu representation, the positioning of agency in Ainu representation? In other words, to what extent are Ainu involved in their own self-representation? Critical to the examination is the background in Japan of state-led discourses of multicultural coexistence, typified, for example, by dissemination of attractive Ainu culture, campaigns spearheaded by Japanese advertising giant Dentsu and others, and the creation of the Symbolic Space for Ethnic Harmony, a national facility in Shiraoi, as well as the mobilization of non-Ainu actors and models in the promotion thereof. So all of the authors that I have listed here are people who have questioned these discourses. And amidst such an atmosphere, there have been several notable productions within the past 4 to 5 years. So for example, Ainu Moshiri, the film on the left, produced by director Fukunaga, features non-actor Ainu who came to be involved in the movie as a result of extensive consultation with the community of Akan where the movie was filmed. Alternatively, the immensely popular manga, Golden Kamuy, raise your hand if you have not heard of the movie or anime, Golden Kamuy. Okay, all right. Apparently has been transformed into an anime and broadcast in many countries throughout the world, and then was transformed into the silver screen in 2024. And of noteworthy attention is that the author, Noda Satoru, did extensive consultation with a renowned Ainu linguist of Chiba University and with an Ainu scholar, Kitahara Jirota, as consultant advisors. Yet, as important as these works may be in terms of increasing popularity of and interest in Ainu culture, they are noteworthy in that they stop there without going beyond or questioning discourses of multicultural coexistence, or examining the importance of the differential positioning of indigeneity in contrast thereto. So by contrast, there are 2 Ainu-driven documentaries. Apologies for not having any English translation of the advertising materials. The one on the left is Ancestral Repatriation, 85 years later, and the one on the right is Hoshba Anna, Return of Ancestors' Soul to the Village. These both present Ainu anger and chagrin at colonialist research agendas, which took Ainu human remains, ancestral remains, to universities and museums. And the Raporo Ainu Nation, filmed in the second film, seeks through its ongoing litigation against the Japanese state and the government of Hokkaido to reframe colonialist histories and reclaim indigenous rights. One member of the film staff of Hoshba Anna has Ainu roots, and the director of Ancestral Repatriation 85 years later consulted extensively with Ainu stakeholders and is continuing to do so in his filming with the Raporo Ainu Nation. Then the film Kamui Chep, Ainu salmon fishing and indigenous rights, features Hatakeyama-san. One very dramatic scene from Hatakeyama's fishing protest has Ainu elders standing on the riverbanks engaging in a heated argument with an official from the Hokkaido government as to whose law it is that is being violated with regards to this fishing act. Importantly, Hatakeyama-san also details the raising of the Ainu village that he lived in his childhood and the forcible displacement of its residents to a location several tens of kilometers away. The scholar Jason Edward Lewis has said, by remembering our history, we can better see the present. By better seeing the present, we can better imagine a future as an imaginative process that integrates history with complex analyses of the present. Ethnography can and should have a powerful role in fostering Indigenous futurisms. So I'll have to leave you to read this slide on your own. I'd like to close by introducing an Ainu futurism, which is the activism of this 91-year-old Ainu poet and artist, Ukaji Shizue, who is involved in activism to transmit and promote the spirit behind the Ainu philosophy and to make it the cornerstone of a new Ainu future, marked by the admittance of an Ainu power. And her message of relationality between humans and other denizens of the earth is one shared by Indigenous peoples the world over, and what I consider a powerful call to us all toward an alternative way of life. So this ends my introduction of 6 films for or about the Ainu. As a very brief conclusion, I'd like to point out that Indigenous media indicates an avenue forward to Indigenous futurities through forced cinema. And while some commercial, non-Ainu created cinema possesses characteristics of Indigenous futurities in its questioning of colonial histories and reimaginations of relations in a post-human era, which refers to an era in which we see ourselves as humans as not the only denizens of this planet. Other commercial Ainu cinema stops at a reproduction of status quo discourses, which leaves some questions for future thought. What are the perspectives on colonial history and the global environment which these self-representational Indigenous or Ainu films urge us to embrace? What are the senses of temporality, how we view time, and consciousness of our relationality to the world and the other living beings here being called into question? And as what I assume, without knowing anything in depth about KAMC, as supporters of filmmaking or experts on cinema or movie consumers, what changes in action and behavior might these changes in consciousness entail for us? So that concludes my very brief presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gaiman. We have about 10 minutes for questions. You've given us 3 questions, but before that, we'd maybe like to ask you a few questions. We have a microphone here. Does anybody have any questions for Professor Gaiman?
Okay, good morning, Professor. Thank you for sharing. It's very insightful. My name is Mega Nusa from Atmajaya, Yogyakarta in Indonesia. My question will be, what's your view on the commercial affordances or costs for these movies? Because these movies will yield commercial costs and it is expected to obtain some commercial benefits. But how does it synchronize with the activism agenda, which is equally important in these movies? What's your view on this, Professor? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So the 3 films that I introduced at the end which were Ainu-driven films, were, as far as I know, of quite low budget and have been acclaimed so far in international film festivals, and in that way are broadcasting the Indigenous message. So my understanding of it is that they have kept production costs down. Very simple answer, but that's my response.
There's another question here, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. I am Nana from Indonesia. I think this issue has been critical issue for over the years. My question is, does Japanese government policy not meet the Ainu people's interests based on your studies? Because what I know, Ainu peoples are between Russia and Japanese location, so it relates to political view of point of view. I think that's the issue. But I want to know, based on your studies, what the exactly point that make this issue keep going on. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a critically important question. I have only been talking about Hokkaido Ainu, and it's important to recognize that the Ainu traditionally lived in the northern part of the Japanese mainland. They are referred to as the Tohoku Ainu, and then throughout the Kuril archipelago, the Kuril Islands, and as well as the southern half of Sakhalin, which are now territories of Russia. President Putin. what kind of a Freudian slip was that? Before the situation in the Ukraine, had recognized the Ainu as an ethnic minority of Russia. I believe that is the official term for them, and Ainu that I know in Kamchatka were petitioning to the Russian government for commercial fishing rights, which is basically the same thing as the Raporo Ainu Nation is doing. The Raporo Ainu Nation litigation is a very forward-looking one, in that it goes back to the history of the annexation of these northern territories of this current nation of Japan, and the fact that no treaties were enacted between the Japanese state and the Ainu people, and that thus the Ainu collective rights should still exist. On the other hand, current policy for the Ainu people is limiting things only to the arena of culture, and at that culture which has been recognized by the cabinet organization which is in charge of vetting funding to municipalities in wherever they are that have Ainu populations in them. So if we talk about nations as groups of people that have political, social, economic power to go along with their cultures, etc., the Ainu people have been stripped of political and economic power, and are forced to enact, to practice their culture within very limited confines, which are being regulated quite strictly by the state. And I think that is something which could be changed if, as the Raporo Ainu Nation is calling for more self-determination over politics and economic issues for the Ainu communities was achieved. It would allow for much greater freedom of representation and control of culture and education for Ainu-led development.
Any further? There's one gentleman right at the back.
Hey, thank you for your presentation. I have a rather personal question for you as an academic, as a researcher, because we're in the midst of a very rapidly changing geopolitical hegemony, and then we have these patterns of Western structures and frameworks, and assuming you're also a Western trained scholar, how do you position yourself when you're dealing with indigenous people, and that too Japan has its own histories of political hegemonies, but then still working with indigenous people as a Western scholar. I mean, not trying to go deep into the identity politics of it, but then how do you position yourself, or how do you, I don't know, how just, yeah.
Thank you very much for your very insightful question. Perhaps the difficulty of my positioning is the reason why my research doesn't have more impact than it does. Trained in Western scholasticism in the sense of having gotten an undergraduate degree in the United States and then a master's degree in the United States. But in an institution which was critical of Western, the hegemony of Western theory, the University of Alaska, where I did my master's degree, has a very strong Indigenous studies program. And the very foundation of Indigenous studies is the centralization of Indigenous worldviews and values. And that is something which I have tried to centralize in my own relations with the Ainu people. On the other hand, Kyushu University, where I did my doctorate, while espousing the emphasis of an emic perspective on things, is also, and Hokkaido University, where I currently work, is someplace that looks up to Western concepts. And so my own broadcasting of messages of the importance of Indigenous worldviews and their own values is something which seems to be falling on deaf ears with regards to the academicism that I do here in Japan. So I'm very grateful to Professor Haldane and to the other members of the committee for the chance to be able to share my thoughts together with you today.